Hello, and I'm going to make a video today on 9b, evolution. This particular section is on natural selection as it shows up there. And the first person we're going to talk to is Jean-Baptiste, a French scientist who actually came up with an idea that said that through the traits of an organism, if they're used, they actually become stronger. If they're not used, they become weaker and then sometimes even disappear. And as you see down here, we actually have three types of giraffe. You may actually recognize the one that is the one that's around today. But before we actually had that giraffe, we had shorter necked giraffes, and we had some that actually fed on the bottom parts of trees, ones that fed on the upper middle part of the tree, and because of that they had to stretch, and because they stretched their necks got longer. And then we had some that actually favored the leaves higher up in the tree, and they had to stretch even more. So the ones that stretched were able to pass that stretching on to their offspring. The ones that didn't were not. So here's a little picture. We actually have this giraffe eating off of bushes, this one reaching for trees, stretching. Disuse, doesn't get the stretch. Using, becomes stronger. And then we actually get the giraffe we have today. And then if we had speciation, let's say we had predators moving into the area, would one of these be more beneficial? If we had a drought and we had damaged plants, would one of these be more beneficial? And I think in almost all cases this one is. So Lamarck said this one became extinct because it didn't get used or disappeared. Wasn't successful in perpetuating the species, so that giraffes now all look this direction. Here's another one. With time, the necks got longer and longer and longer. Shorter necked ones didn't survive, were not as viable as longer necked ones. And then of course you know the story about how an elephant got its long nose. Elephant back in the day actually had a nose more like a shoe. Small little nose for breathing, and then there was this alligator that somehow enticed it to come down and touch the water, and it pulled, then it pulled, then it pulled, then it pulled, and it's got a much longer nose, which of course was able to pass on to all of its offspring. And the short-nosed elephant wasn't able to survive, and long-nosed one apparently was. Next person we're going to talk about is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin lived back in the 1800s. He didn't age very well, but this is a much older picture of Charles Darwin. He worked as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle, His Majesty's Service Beagle, and there's a diagram of the Beagle sitting in a harbor, probably not the Galapagos, which he is actually known for studying, but as you'll see, he traveled around the world. This looks more like a Polynesian type island, where they're volcanic in origin, and we had lots of friendly people in boats coming out to see anybody who would come visit. So he actually sails around the world collecting specimens so he can take them back to Europe and study them, or give them to other people who can study them. This is the path that he actually took. I'm using my ViewSonic touch screen. I'm going to try to stay away from the mouse because that click bothers me, and I'm sure it actually goes into the video. So I'm going to try to touch my screen, and you can actually see if I do touch it, you should be able to make my finger see my finger moving around. But this is the path, and if I go back one, how do I right click? I'm going to have to click. Let's go back one. This is the path that he takes. He's leaving from England, and he travels down the Atlantic Ocean, hits a couple of islands on the way out, hits South America for trading and getting supplies. And you can see he goes through the islands down here in the Cape of Good Hope, and then comes up this coast of South America. And when they go out this direction, they end up at the Galapagos Islands, where he does the study on his famous study on finches and also the tortoise that live there. And then when they're done with that, and actually the iguanas, the only marine lizard, only marine water lizard, loves to swim on the planet. And then he actually comes around, he goes to Australia, and they go to the Hobart Islands, and they go to the islands over here in the Indian Ocean, and they hit Africa, then they go back over to South America before they head all the way back, hitting the Azores before they get back to England. And he brought back thousands of different species of animals that had never been seen in Europe before. So it was kind of nice to actually have a naturalist go there rather than just sailors. These are the Galapagos finches, and what Darwin actually thinks is that there was a common ancestor in South America that somehow blew across that part of the Pacific Ocean, landed on the Galapagos Islands, and because there are so many different new environments, they changed. So we had some that lived in the ground, we had some that actually ate cactus, we had some that eat insects, some that eat nuts and other things. So we have insect eaters. So what happened basically is it started with one ancestor and then it moves over, and then we have these that are moving in this direction, a different genus, and then we have this one which was a common ancestor for these two genus, and they actually went over to the species, as you can see, going off. The closer these guys are together, the more they are related. So these two finch right here are probably more related than those two finch right there because of their common ancestor is much different. It goes all the way back to this point when these two actually go to that point. We'll talk about this. This is a phylogenetic tree. We'll talk about that a little later in 9C. Overpopulation. So natural selection is actually driven by a couple of different stresses. Overpopulation is something that all population is a group of breeding individuals living in the same sort of area. So overpopulation is a problem for most things. Organisms produce more offspring than the area or the niche can sustain. And if you take a look at it, we're exceeding what's called the carrying capacity or the K capacity. Not exactly sure where this picture is taken, but you have to take a look at that, and that's a pretty highly densely populated area. Excuse me. Water and food and space may become a problem, and I have to think if people actually lived this close together, we'd probably have more issues with people getting into each other's space. World population growth, pretty easy to see this happening. For a long time, population didn't get above probably 100,000. And if you notice, it goes up and it goes through all these things that you study in history class. Finally gets in the Middle Ages and the numbers start going up, but then we get the Black Plague, or the Plague or Black Death, bubonic plague that actually killed about a third of the population of Europe, so that you can actually see this on a population graph. And then the whole thing breaks out and we go to 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. And in my life I've actually seen 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, and just a few months ago we got to 7 billion, and I'm sure we'll get to 8 and 9. The problem is when do we reach this carrying capacity? Where do we reach the capacity where the environment can no longer sustain the population? So, things that we have to worry about: accidents and pollution, disease, starvation, predation, old age, hunting. These are all population losses. So we keep actually making new people or new individuals in the population, but there are all these stresses that are out there that are actually causing the population to take nosedives. Here is a natural critter example where we have what's called the breeding stock, and as the winter ends in spring and plant life becomes more plentiful, what happens is the plant eaters' populations take off, and this is what's called the seasonal surplus. And then when we get into June and July, we probably find out that predators, all the numbers are also increasing because their food is increasing, just like these guys are increasing because of their food. Grass, leaves, trees are increasing, and you can see the surplus is now, the seasonal surplus is now going to be decreased by starvation. If you eat all the plant material in one area, that's either going to drive the critters out to other areas, which causes more stress there, and eventually we'll start running out of food source. Living in close proximity like this, we can have a problem with disease and parasites. We can have accidents, like this deer actually steps on top of the pheasant. That would be bad. We have weather incidents like hurricanes or tornadoes going through, or drought. We have hunting. Man actually likes all of these for meat sources, protein sources. We have predators, like I said, wolves, coyotes, fox are going to start taking off when these numbers start increasing. And then you can throw some other things. But this is the true carrying capacity. This environment can hold this amount the way it's set up right now, but if we actually get into climate change and it gets drier or wetter, this number could actually go up or go down. And here's another example of carrying capacity. You keep putting population in there, and you have weather, human development, loss of habitat, old age, disease and parasites, predators and hunting, starvation and accidents, which are going to drain the population, keeping it what's called carrying capacity, and carrying capacity. It's the population which can be naturally sustained by a particular area or niche. Bacteria growth even shows carrying capacity. Here you actually have, it says fewer nerve cells, but you give the bacteria food, you give it warmth, you give it light if that's what it requires, and what happens is the number of cells increases, and then we get what's called exponential growth, where the number goes up very, very, very fast. You can see some of them are actually dying as well, but they're much more living, and then it reaches a stationary, sustained carrying capacity, where the population actually seems to be holding steady, where the population stays. We still have more death, but we have a very viable population. And then we have what's called the death phase, where they start running out of food. They start actually producing enough poison in there where we're starting to kill them, where we have very few cells remaining. And if populations are like this, and they truly run out of food, or they have so much population growth that they've poisoned their water, their air, their food, we may find out that we get extinction. And that's the one thing that species don't particularly care about. Since their job is to perpetuate the species, extinction is bad. Competition, organisms must struggle to survive. Here we have a couple of eagles that are fighting over territory. They're fighting over a mate. They're fighting over, maybe they're just practicing to find out who's the alpha bird. But we have stresses like they have to fight over limited resources. Resources like food. Resources like water. Resources like space in which to live, like these bear are doing up in Alaska. Very prime salmon hunting, and you can see some bear. They're actually watching for the salmon to jump up. You can see bear actually looking in the water, but you have some that are actually fighting over maybe prime fishing spots, so they can fight over space. And then the last one, they can fight over mates, like these buck are doing, trying to figure out who's going to be the buck that's going to service all those nice doe in the populations that are out there. Genetic variants. When we talked about meiosis, we talked about DNA differences in crossing over, and what you can do in crossover is you get the two homologous chromosomes from mom or dad where they crisscross and they actually replace some of the material. Some of B gets on A and some of A gets on B. Then we actually split those, and we have an AB and an AB and an AB and an AB. If you notice, we have capital letters showing you dominant, then you have smaller letters for recessive, and we actually can end up with three different types, the original type that we had, and then two different ones here in the middle. So we basically get four different meiosis, through meiosis, four different gametes. Whether these are they're probably sperm. If this was actually oogenesis, we'd only have one that's viable. The other three are called polar cells. These two would actually not go into the next step, and then this one would actually not go into the next step in terms of fertilization, but we'd actually have one viable one. So this is why we actually get, in this case, we have five, which would be quintuplets, and you can actually see that these are fraternal twins. They do not look alike, although we do get four females and a male. But if you take a look at all their faces, there are similarities in them, but none of them look alike, and it's all because of this genetic variance. If you look over here for these mollusks, they're the same species, maybe, but they have definite variances, and I'm only saying the same species because of shape and size. But the idea for a species is they can reproduce with each other. I'm not sure if that one right there can reproduce with this one. They may actually be genetically so different that they no longer can mate, but you can see variances in here. Some of these would be more beneficial in different types of substrates, whether it be rocks or sand or algae or whatever. They can actually hide better. They wouldn't be seen, so they're more likely to survive and pass their genetic material off to the next generation. So genetic variance is very important. These are peppered moths, and we're going to see them on the next slide, as you saw. We also can talk about survival of the fittest. These are peppered moths, and if you take a look, you can see this tree is covered by lichen, which is an algae fungus combination, and we actually found in the trees over in Europe, especially England, where the Industrial Revolution began. We actually found lots of lichen on these trees, and we have two different types of pepper moths. We had one that made up 97% of the population, and one that made up 3%. And why did this make up such a small number? It's probably because it sticks out like a sore thumb. And it's a little harder to make out the difference between these two and these two. And then what happened in the Industrial Revolution back in the 19th century, we had lots of industrial areas, and if you didn't believe that, maybe we could actually take a look at a picture like this, and you could imagine this in large cities worldwide and producing a bunch of soot that would land on the trees. It would actually kill the algae, which would kill the lichen, and then we go down to the bark, and then the bark would get all black because of the soot. And now we actually have a smaller percentage here in the natural lichen forest, and their numbers increase because they can hide a little better than the white peppered moth. And pepper, you can actually see why they're called peppered moths. This would be, I'm not sure what they call it. It's the same species, they can mate with each other, but this was the dominant trait. And it was actually artificially selected against because of man-made pollution. So organisms have are best suited to survive in the environments will survive and pass their genetics on to the next generation. So competition actually starts with fertilization. Only one of these male gametes, the sperm, can actually fertilize this egg, and once the first one gets in here, the rest of them all lose. So we started with survival of the fittest. The fastest sustaining male gamete wins the prize. And then we also have survival of the fittest when we start thinking about predator and prey, whether it be wolves and rabbits, or whether it be is that a cheetah? Cheetah and some sort of a wildebeest, some sort of a large meat-eating or a plant-eating meat source. And they always pick the weakest ones, so they're not going for the strongest ones, which are more likely to survive. They're pulling out the weakest ones, and I'm not sure. Looks like he's going after this one, or one that's off screen. Then we have reproduction. Mommy and her puppies, mommy and her baby, and we have lots of little baby turtles over here. And reproduction basically is the way that you pass your traits on to someone else, and that's the job of you as an individual, is to survive long enough so you get the chance to perpetuate the species. And of course there are lots of ways of, we have mammary glands in mammals, so the baby can actually be fed. They tend to spend a lot more time with mom than these guys. I don't think they'll ever even know their mom, but they have a lot more offspring than what we have because of the care. So these guys are actually moving off into the water, and what mom is hoping is that any two of them out there, again, the one that's more likely to survive, the strongest that will survive, fastest will survive. She's hoping at least two of these will actually live long enough to support the species, to reproduce. We have what's called speciation. Eventually species can change, and they can change so much that they can no longer mate with the original species. This would be considered a new species. And we have cichlids. These are actually freshwater fish, and we actually have fish eaters and snail eaters and algae scrapers and insect eaters and leaf eaters and zooplankton eaters. And because of this, they've all had to morph. They've had to change their ability to hide from whatever they're trying to feed upon, or to actually hide from things that wanted to feed upon them. So these have actually moved. They have the basic idea of the cichlid head, but they can no longer mate with each other. These are 6 different species of cichlid fish. We also have a salamander species in California that has an original ancient species, and how they actually find out ancient, I'm not exactly sure, unless it's a DNA RNA thing. But they've got the ancestral population up here in Northern California, and because of the mountains and the valley in between, what has happened is that as the population grew, some of these went off this direction and some of these went off this direction, and we actually found out that maybe there was a little bit more water on one area and a little drier on the other area, and these guys actually had to get to survive. The ones that had pigmentation and they pass them on to their generation, and as it got drier, maybe they need to get more pigmented. And then if the population grows all the way down to this area, we get down here, and these are the same ancestor, based on the same ancestors, but they're so different now that they no longer can mate. That's called speciation, creating a new species. Example of natural speciation or antibiotic resistance. Overpopulation leads to competition controlling the numbers. Let's actually say we have bacteria, and the bacteria is growing all over, and we have lots of different types of bacteria out there. And then of one type of bacteria, we have some that are more resistant to some things, whether it be light, whether whether it be poisons, whether it be desiccation, running out of water, whatever. But what we do is we add in antibacterial anything. And as you know about antibacterial, they say they kill 99 or 99.9 or 99.1 or 98.73% of the bacteria. And that's not the scary part. It's just what part do they actually kill? What about the 1% that survives? This, after selection, you can find out that they have a much higher resistance. And who's going to actually perpetuate the species? The other ones have been selected against. So now our final population is going to be all orange and red. It's a very resistant form of bacteria, which now this is not able to kill. So I highly recommend that you do not use antibacterial. Use soap and water. It works the same. Types of evolution, we have convergent evolution. Convergent means that they come together from different sources. And we have divergent, and we have parallel. We're actually talking about this where we have two different types of species that come in to be looking very, very different. In this case, it's three species. We have shark, which is a fish, ichthyosaur, which was a reptile. It's now extinct back in the age of the dinosaur, and then dolphin, which is a mammal. And if you take a look at the shape of the body, you take a look at the fin orientation, you take a look at how fast these guys could all swim. We have this one which swims back and forth with its tail. This one went back and forth with its tail. This one goes up and down. That's what a mammal does. It's got the same motion bones that you have. And if you swim in water, you know what dolphining is. If you do a butterfly, you actually move your body like a dolphin moves, although they're much better at it than you are. So convergent evolution are different species that actually end up looking the same because of the environment in which they live. So non-related organisms can obtain similar traits because they live in similar environments, and that's evolution. Types of evolution: divergent. This is going to be related organisms evolve different traits because they live in different environments. So here are the warblers from another example, sort of like the finches, that start off with one ancestral sample way back then. Some of them became fruit eaters, and because of that they actually acquired a different beak. The ones with that shaped beak actually took over that type of food source, and they passed them on, those traits on to their offspring, and it morphed more into a different beak than if you take a look at all the other beaks that are in here. But basically what happened is we had some variability in a species, and some of them became more like seed eaters, and some of them became more like other seed eaters, when some of them became more like insect eaters, or cactus, where they actually feed inside the cactus plant, or ground, or woodpecker like. So their beaks actually changed, all coming from the same ancestor. Same as that salamander back there we talked about in California. They come from the same ancestral population, but because they actually moved into areas that were different, they changed. And because of that, these guys no longer can mate with each other, but they have to find somebody who's like them because of differences in genetics, as well as maybe the external sexual male and female differences. Rates of evolution. Gradualism. Gradualism is when an organism very slowly evolves over maybe a grand amount of time, millions, thousands of millions of years, which would be a billion. But some of them actually millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, or thousands of years. You start off with one ancestral population, like the salamanders, and because of the fact that they got broken by either geography or something, they actually became two different species that can no longer mate. So it's a speciation. This is like Darwin's idea of natural selection. There's another school who thinks about punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated means that we have very quick changes, very drastic changes. So these are quick changes in the environment. They cause sudden changes in speciation. So here comes one, and it just lived fine and dandy for a long time, and then all of a sudden, bam, something happened, and this one became more likely to survive. This one changed, and then it changed into a different one. And then we have this one. This one didn't change at all. And then we have this one which changed. This one changed much farther back, and because of the speciation, because of the big change in these no longer can mate. Where these could mate with themselves, these could mate with themselves, these could mate with themselves. Now we have 3 different populations, probably living in 3 different areas. Maybe drier environments, more, I'm not sure what would be there, but more at least colorful, and then maybe an everyday type of section. This is where the organism lives for a long time, and then for some other reason evolves very quickly with time. Who came up with this idea? The guy's name is Stephen Jay Gould, and he's actually comes up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium. So gradualism, they change a little bit over time, and punctuated equilibrium, where they live the same way for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's a sudden change, and the speciation that occurs almost instantaneous. Okay, last one we got to talk about. This is the stop of 9b, selective breeding or artificial selection. There's a mustard plant. Actually, let me give you the stuff. Humans have selected traits they prefer in crops or livestock, and this can lead to speciation. We had a mustard plant which actually became all 5 of these. And I have not eaten this one as far as I know, but I've eaten the other 4. In fact, cauliflower and broccoli fairly often, cabbage fairly often, kale once in a while. But if you take a look, what they've done is they took the cauliflower, took the flowers, and they made them sterile. And then somehow they became bulbous and larger. This one actually suppressed the flower development, and we actually had more of the stocky stuff. This one suppressed the internode length, which actually means they didn't have these large areas. So we actually had leaves that went this way, and then enlargement of leaves, and actually enhancement of the lateral meristems, where these guys over on the side, not the apical meristem, but the lateral meristems, they became larger and stronger, and it actually started producing these more bulbous ends to them. We've done it with dogs. All dogs go back to the wolf ancestor. We can prove that genetically. And then what happened is we found some of these wolves that actually, whatever they did, they could put up with man. They could put up with man's diet, which was more grainy than meat. They actually came, and some of them went this way, and some went this way, and some broke off that way, and some broke off that way, which means these 2 are probably more related to each other than these 2. These 2 are more related to each other than these 2 or those 2. These 2 are probably more related to each other than these, because they're on the same part of this tree. And then we have the example of the Oreo cow. Not exactly sure why this was beneficial. I'm not sure if this is a milk producer, which I think it is, or a meat producer, or both. But for some reason, people have actually wanted this kind of a cow with triple stuff, or single stuff, or double stuff. But there's basically black on both ends with a white in the middle. Oreo cows. Okay, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Next thing we'll go into is 9C, but that will end it for us. And thank you for stopping by. Bye.